This is one of the most bizarre schemes that Napoleon Hill has come up with thus far. Basically, Think and Grow Rich was starting to dwindle in sales, and none of the other ideas to bring in the royalties was working. What better advertisement was there for the New Thought movement than to raise a selected group of children using only those principles? Come along with us as we walk through the idea of creating upstanding citizens using only the principles that Hill advocated. All aboard the Kentucky Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Adopting 15 children. Something had to be done to garner national attention. Hill's lectures and touring the country was not bringing in revenue. So, the Hills came up with a scheme to adopt 15 children. These children would be brought up with the principles taught in the writings of Napoleon and Rosalie as the grand experiment. It was thought by raising the children free from the corrupting influence of bad parenting that they would grow to be upstanding citizens, not taking into account that Hill had abandoned all of his natural children throughout his life. The first children, Jeanne and Helen. Again, according to the untold story of Napoleon Hill, the April 16th, 1939 edition of the Kansas City Star ran a story and referred to Napoleon Hill as a Florida philanthropist. In the article, Rosalie laid out the plans that they had together. Quote, our original plan, unquote, Rosalie explains in the article, quote, was to purchase a boat and travel in it to the countries we had always wanted to see. At the time, the thought that this might be selfish on our part didn't enter our minds. We came here to stay only a short while, and I began the search for a housekeeper, unquote. According to the Hills, one of the potential housekeepers had a young child named Jeanne. They felt that Jeanne was not being properly raised to meet her potential. At this very moment, the Hills decided upon adopting 15 children according to their principles. The first to be adopted was Jeanne, and the second was a child named Helen, whose parents and exact age were never identified. Helen was identified as being in the Hill home for a few weeks. Adoption qualifications. The Hills were specific on who qualified for their adoption. The children had to be between the ages of 5 and 9 years old and have no physical or mental defects. Add to this that they had to be orphans with no parents, quote, and yet not to be confined in an orphanage or other public institution, unquote. This seemed like an impossible task, as any child between those ages would immediately be taken to an orphanage upon the loss of the parents. And it may be for those exact reasons that no other children were adopted after Jeanne and Helen. We also need to take into account that between the years of 1930 and World War II, it was becoming more acceptable to adopt children and infants, whereas before they were given to workhouses and orphanages and left to their own survival skills. The national child labor laws were coming into focus, and so children were no longer a part of the labor force. Also, the first Child Welfare League of America in 1921 was established. This league was instrumental in changing the criteria for adoption, whether as a permanent or temporary placement. Also, the American Association of Social Workers was also founded that year. With these two in place, the adoption of children began to form guidelines as to who could and could not adopt a child. Inside these guidelines, there were adoption practices such as matching, confidentiality, and sealed records. With these new rules and regulations, We could see why Napoleon and Rosalie was more in tune with trying to adopt a child who was outside of the system rather than one that the law had say over. By today's standards, it is highly unlikely for a couple to adopt 15 children to experiment on psychologically. Possible reasons for the adoptions. One line of thought about this announcement was that it was simply a public relations stunt, that the Hills were simply casting a net as far as possible to gain children for their bizarre human experiment. Napoleon even proclaimed that each of the child subjects would be tracked and their successes or failures in this endeavor would be made public. Again, from the source, The Untold Story of Napoleon Hill, quote, whatever we try with a child will be noted down, whether the experiment proves success or failure, unquote. Napoleon told the Kansas City Star, quote, and only that way we can hope, by elimination, to arrive at what will be scientifically considered a proper method to bring up children, unquote. Another line of thought is that it was done for a tax write-off or possibly to gain financially. After all, there could have been a lot of money come in to support the research, and the Hill family would benefit from the financial windfall. It would not be the first time that Napoleon Hill lived off of the charitable donations of one of his schemes. Again, according to the source material, quote, the official biography of Hill explains that Napoleon's income tax records of the time showed two adopted dependents, but, quote, it is not clear how long the two children actually lived in the Hill home, nor what became of them, unquote. It is thought that Jeanne was returned to her mother at some point with nothing in the source material to state what happened to Helen. She could have possibly been returned to her existing family or given to the local orphanage. We can only hope that her life was in no way disturbed by the experiment. In next week's video, we will dive into the cult of the metaphysicians and the immortal babies, and how the Hills got mixed up in this thicket of trouble. Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the outstanding Appalachian people. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.